Good evening, everyone. We're just about ready to get started. My name is Julie Hurwitz, and I am going to be moderating this evening's event. And I am also representing the co-sponsors of this wonderful panel from the National Lawyers Guild, the Michigan Coalition for Human Rights, the Coalition for Police Transparency and Accountability, and the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights here at Wayne State Law School. And on behalf of the sponsors, we're thrilled to have you all join us for this very important and critical conversation. Before we get the panelists going, I would like to invite Jeffrey Edison up to the microphone to just get things going with the reading of a beautiful and powerful poem that was written by Aneb Kgositsile, otherwise known as Dr. Gloria House. And Jeffrey, if you could come up and read that poem for us to get us in the mood. And I want to welcome everyone who is with us virtually as well. It's my understanding that over 300 people have registered to observe this panel tonight.
Greetings, everyone. It is certainly my honor and privilege to recite to you these sacred words of our beloved sister, comrade, Sister Aneb Kgositsile. Come, justice. There's a quiet perfections and sweetness in justice. Knowing this, we long for it. We long for it. We pray for it in our daily efforts to end conflict, to invite peace into our circles. We chant for it with the drumming of our heartbeats and our breathing, and we hold our ear to the ground, listening for the coming of a new world. But there is war in Ukraine. Murderous insanity, havoc and suffering in Uvalde, San Francisco, Haiti, lies and evil of unprecedented magnitude in the everyday news and rush of a crumbling culture. But justice, justice, never abandoning this churning field of misery, awaits the moment of revelation, a blaze of light in this whirlwind of rampaging lawlessness. Sometimes bewildered, sometimes smothered by the gust of cruelty engulfing us, we persevere. We push against all the policies that would imprison us, believing that the flame will break through, as it has in the past, in the very moment when our will wavers and strength is gone. We persist, knowing there is a luscious perfection, joy, and peace in those moments when justice redeems our hope and sets the world aright again. Yes, there is luscious perfection, joy, and peace whenever justice comes.
And the poet is with us here tonight, Sister Aneb. Thank you. We're thrilled to have you all here and those of you in the virtual audience as well. And so excited about the opportunity to engage in this critically important, timely, and difficult conversation about justice, really. How do we achieve it? How do we obtain it? How do we maintain it? What do we need to do? We're here tonight to talk about alternatives to policing. We have a preeminent panel, each of whom have been in the struggle for police accountability or alternatives to policing throughout their political, legal, and activist lives. And I'm going to briefly introduce all four of our panelists now, and so we can just get the program rolling a bit more smoothly. Erin Keith, who is from the Detroit Justice Center. She's worked for the past 4 years on their staff, and for 3.5 years, she was the staff attorney, and she is currently, for the past year, the managing policy counsel for DJC. I've had the honor and privilege of working with DJC over the past 4 years and have had the pleasure of hearing Erin speak on this issue more than once. She and DJC, the Detroit Justice Center, stand as one of the most clear-sighted and articulate advocates for the abolition and defund police movement in our community. Also with us on the screen is our own Congresswoman, Rashida Tlaib. Rashida has been in the trenches for more than 15 years, fighting in the streets, first from the Sugar Law Center, then in the Michigan legislature, and now in US Congress. She's been fighting for equality, justice, the rights of working people, the rights of people of color, and the goal of justice for all in our criminal justice and law enforcement institutions. Now, as a congressman, Rashida has spearheaded the Justice for All Act, which, if passed, would amend and strengthen the Civil Rights Act, which would, among other things, end the draconian doctrine of qualified immunity and end the antiquated barriers to holding municipalities accountable and liable for systemic acts of police violence, racism, and unconstitutional conduct. We have with us as well Andrea Ritchie, a nationally recognized expert on policing and criminalization, who now lives here in our own community of Detroit. Andrea has been an advocate, an activist, a writer, an attorney for years, struggling and fighting on these issues. She has written and co-written dozens of articles and books on systemic police violence, racism, homophobia, and the call for abolition and defunding. She is the co-founder of Interrupting Criminalization and has just released a book this past August, No More Police, A Case for Abolition. An excerpt of that book was just published this past September in The Nation, entitled Why We Don't Say Reform the Police. And finally, our own esteemed honorable state senator, Stephanie Chang. Stephanie has been in the trenches of the struggle for civil rights and social justice, first as a community organizer for 10 years in Detroit, working on a number of issues, including criminal justice reform and the rights of the wrongfully convicted. In 2014, Stephanie was elected to the state house and is now serving her second term as a state senator. As a state senator, in what was until just recently a strong Republican majority state legislature, Stephanie has been working tirelessly to push for significant legislative reforms intended to hold our police and law enforcement officers and agencies more accountable on a statewide level, with the hope of having her bills strengthened and actually voted on now that there is a Democratic majority in our state government. We'll see. Each panelist will give a 7 to 10 minute overview statement presenting their views and perspectives on these questions, and then addressing the thorny topics of, can the police be reformed, or must the institution of policing be completely dismantled for us to obtain justice in this country? After their presentations, we will move into a more interactive conversation between and among our panelists to allow them to speak to one another and to you, to grapple with some of the difficult, both short-term and long-term strategic goals and possibilities regarding this issue. So we're going to start with Erin Keith presenting, I think, a brief PowerPoint presentation.
Can you all hear me? So again, my name is Erin. I currently serve as the Managing Policy Counsel at the Detroit Justice Center. And I really wanted to ground our conversation tonight in data that's relevant to our community here in Metro Detroit, data that really colors why this topic is so important, why it's not just a matter of opinion, and why it really can't wait, why we really need alternatives to policing now. And so first, I kind of wanted to give a background as to why I became someone who identified with abolitionist ideas. I began to align myself with abolitionist principles when I started asking the question, why? Why does my community look like this? Why isn't there money to invest in neighborhoods? Why does the public safety conversation seems to always lead back to more police when I see so many other areas that need attention for my community to feel safe? When I was in law school and Michael Brown was killed, and then Freddie Gray was killed, and then Tamir Rice was killed, and then Sandra Bland was killed, and then Philando Castile was killed, I asked why? Why am I in the classroom discussing this shooting as an analytical exercise? Why are people trying to justify these killings? Why are these officers getting off? Why are there more protections for those with a blue uniform than with brown skin? When I worked in the juvenile justice system and had opportunities to represent youth accused of delinquency, I asked why. Why are there more school resource officers than social workers? Why is there more state-of-the-art surveillance tech in school than state-of-the-art trauma intervention programming? When I worked in the adult system back in Detroit representing clients, I asked why again. Why are people whose first infraction was a traffic offense sitting in prison now for something else? Why do I have clients who have been stopped by officers 10, 20, or 30 times to have as many traffic offenses as they have? Why is what police spend a lot of the time and resources doing, Detroit's purportedly a more violent city and more crime-ridden than all of those other places, why is it that we're spending so much time on traffic stops? And if you follow the whys and are open to the complexities, I think it leads you towards abolition, because you can't simply reform a system that's functioning as it was designed to function, and that has had its origins in slave patrols protecting whiteness and what white folks believe to be their property. And so with that, I want to again turn to the data. Why use the word abolition in the first place? Well, abolition can be defined as the act of ending a pattern, practice, behavior, or institution. It can apply in a multitude of contexts to eradicate a multitude of harms, especially those of a systemic nature, where merely reforming such a system would essentially allow those harms to persist. We have to work towards creating a world where society's reliance on police is wholly unnecessary. And if we're too scared to name that goal and to say it, we won't get there. Why use the term defund? Well, advocates use terms like reallocate resources for years to no avail, while police budgets grew excessively. Defund is another way of saying divest. When we divest, we have money to invest. So to divest from policing, divesting involves removing money from the criminal punishment system, carceral bureaucracies, and their actors. This can mean divesting from policing, but might also include divesting from jails, prisons, detention centers, and other problematic private actors like bail bonds companies. To invest in communities. Investing involves moving resources to communities to fund things that would in fact make those communities safer and more equitable. It allows communities impacted by over-policing and mass incarceration to drive the solution. So when we look at how the killings in 2020 began that involved police violence, 94 people were killed after a mental illness or welfare check. 121 people were killed after a traffic stop. 188 people were killed after nonviolent domestic disturbance, and 251 people were killed after other nonviolent offenses, which means that 58% of killings began when police responded to nonviolent incidents. I'll say that again. 58% of killings began when police responded to nonviolent incidents. When we look at, again, why is divest, invest necessary? Increasing police funding does not reduce crime, and specifically does not reduce homicides. A review of law enforcement funding over time demonstrates that increased police funding does not result in decreased crime. According to the National Police Funding Database in Little Rock, Arkansas, they had more than twice as many police per 1,000 residents as other similarly sized cities. Richmond, Virginia had almost 3 times as many. Despite this overrepresentation of police, Richmond's 2021 homicide number increased by 60% over the 5-year pre-pandemic average, and Little Rock's homicide rate increased 73% above the 5-year pre-pandemic average. Cities basically are showing us in their own data that the number of police that they have and the police funding increasing does not reduce homicides and does not make those communities safer. Now let's take this to Detroit. In fiscal year 2020, Detroit police spent $317 million on the Detroit Police Department's general fund, far more than any other department, including housing or health. Including other funds such as state and federal grants, the total DPD budget for fiscal year 20 was $330 million. That means we're spending 1 out of every $3 from the city's general fund on policing, when we have so many other things that need to be supported. Why does this matter? Well, the Detroit Police Department is not effective at keeping our communities safe. Detroit has one of the lowest rates for solving violent crimes in the country. 41% was the DPD's average arrest rate for murder investigations from 2010 to 2017, and 12% was the DPD's average arrest rate for rape investigations in that same time period. Half of all criminal prosecutions in Michigan are for minor traffic offenses, like driving with a suspended license. Many of these offenses directly criminalize poverty and do nothing to improve public safety. According to a 2020 task force report, driving without a valid license was the 3rd most common reason that people were booked into jails in Michigan. Driving without a valid license was the most serious charge at jail admission for 12% of Black men and 15% of Black women, compared to just 6% for both white men and women, according to Pew data. And there's no correlation between the number of police officers and crime rates. So why is this our reality? Well, it's not just ours. It's the reality of a lot of our neighboring municipalities. Let's look at Dearborn. Dearborn's total police budget is $47.1 million. As the police budget goes up, community resources have seen their budget shrink, including water, sewer, parks and recreation, public works, libraries, housing, and downtown development. Up from only 25% in 2007, the Dearborn Police Department now receives 35% of the city's general fund. As police funding takes up more and more, other departments need to become self-sustaining or lose funding. And how do police use that money? Well, in 2021, Dearborn Police spent $1.96 million on weapons and $2.37 million on overtime and holiday pay. Meanwhile, as you can see here, Dearborn shuttered its health department in 2013 and has had inadequate resources to respond to flooding over the last year. But what else do we know? We know that 73% of all arrests in Dearborn are made in a region that borders Detroit, and that Black people are disproportionately targeted. 54% of people arrested are Black. Only 4% of Dearborn residents are Black. What does this mean? Dearborn PD spends millions of dollars each year to criminalize and arrest Black Detroiters. The police are not effective at addressing harm. Over 80% of the Border Crime Initiative team's arrests were for misdemeanors. Serious crimes went down in 2020 and arrest rates were even lower. 229 auto thefts were reported in 2020, but only 46 arrests resulted. Lastly, Accountability for Dearborn has found that only 10% of arrests in Dearborn are conducted for reasons of violence or interpersonal harm. We can also look at Livonia. The total police budget in Livonia was $26.5 million. What does that pay for? What does Livonia's general fund pay for? 2 out of every $3 in Livonia's budget is spent on police and fire. In 2021, Livonia spent $283 per capita on police. We can also look at what they're doing with their money. In 2019, Livonia PD made 4,700 arrests, but issued over 30,000 minor citations. 60% of those arrested were Black. And again, Livonia's population is less than 5% Black. So who is Livonia policing? Black and brown people. Livonia spends $6 million more on police than on parks, libraries, public works, the court, and downtown development combined. And lastly, we can look at Ferndale. Of the 18,504 calls to service received by Ferndale PD last year, only 8.7 were labeled high priority, robbery or assault. The rest were civil matters and complaints, abandoned vehicles, etc. In 2020, Ferndale police arrested 528 people. Of these, 35 involved use of force. For comparison, Livonia police used force 34 times in 2019, but made 4,700 arrests. Ferndale's population is 6.3% Black, but 59.5% of the people arrested in Ferndale in 2020 were Black. This indicates what many of us who live in this area already know. Ferndale is policing Black visitors to the city for mostly minor infractions. So what could we fund instead? I know that data seemed kind of bleak, but let's turn it around. What could we do instead? Well, first, I think, and DJC thinks, we could build 18 restorative justice centers for $17 million apiece. We could provide a $10,000 child care tax income credit to 31,700 families when 48% of children in Detroit are living in poverty. We could create mental health and rehabilitation facilities with beds for 244 patients. We could create 10,000 living wage jobs for people in the city. We could house every homeless person in Detroit in $90,000 homes and give a $5,000 tax credit to many homes facing foreclosure. Within 2 years, we could renovate and modernize all DPS-CD schools. Other communities are already doing this. Ann Arbor recently put steps in place to create what they're calling an unarmed 911 response program, reimagining what it could look like to have someone be able to respond to emergencies that's not a police officer. We've also seen in other counties innovative things like Safety Patrol handing out vouchers for vehicle repairs instead of tickets. We've seen school boards voting unanimously to remove police from public schools so that they have money to do things like have nurses in their school, have social workers in their school, have restorative justice programming in their school. So this is not far-fetched. It's just up to us to educate ourselves and learn what we could do instead. And lastly, I want to just drive home this point. Defunding the police promotes accountability, okay? It reveals overspending. It shows where overfunding is not working to rebut carceral narratives that departments just need more money to be effective. It promotes refunding communities by encouraging an analysis of what services are being neglected to fund policing in order to redirect this funding towards community resources and evidence-based solutions. And lastly, it empowers the people. It allows community members to hold police accountable for their performance or lack thereof, to hold municipalities accountable for their spending on police, and gives the community grounds to advocate for changes to policing and abolition. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Julie. Thank you.
A lot to digest, a lot to think about, a lot to talk about. I'm now going to invite Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib to present. Rashida?
Yep. Thank you, Julie. Thank you all so much. That was very powerful. So I'm excited to be with all of you tonight for this really important discussion that I'm incredibly passionate about. And, you know, as many of you all know right now, many of my colleagues are moving with such urgency when it comes to policing, but you don't see that same urgency when it comes to passing some sort of form of universal health care in our country. I do want to thank the incredible host, David Keith Center for Civil Rights at Wayne State, Detroit Coalition for Police Transparency and Accountability, of course, our amazing Detroit and Michigan National Lawyers Guild, and the Michigan Coalition for Human Rights for really having the courage to have this conversation that I feel like many of our neighbors across the country want to talk more about. It's great to be here with all the experts and the folks on the ground who give credibility to the work I am doing and some of my other courageous colleagues that are doing around moving away from this conversation that somehow policing is going to erase homelessness and poverty and various broken systems in our country. We all know, and I know I'm speaking to the choir, that we can argue that realizing real public safety is much bigger than simply the absence of gunshots. In my mind, it is the presence of justice and the extension of opportunity to live and thrive to every American and not just the most privileged among us. When we talk about public safety, we need to be talking about poverty and hunger and homelessness, our education, our healthcare system, mass transit, clean air and water. We can't police away homelessness and poverty. We can't police away the rise of domestic violence across our nation. We can't police away the mental health crisis that every corner of our country is experiencing. It is so sad to hear that a parent gets a call from a school that their child is not at the counselor's office, but in custody of a police officer. Criminalization will not create a thriving community. We need real investments in our community. That's how we create safe communities. And we understand that we have to examine, for me and many others that I know talk about this, we have to examine the budget priorities that we have at all levels of government. You heard it from Detroit Justice Center. In 2020, one out of every $3 from the city of Detroit's general fund was spent on policing, greatly overshadowing our investment around education, public health, and other items that I feel like can really address the goal of making sure that we all have the ability to thrive. You know, when I see 48% of our children in Detroit are living in poverty, I don't know how people don't understand that alone. If we can address that alone, we can start seeing much more effective, meaningful transformation of having, again, thriving communities. You know, the same thing is happening at the federal level. I know my colleague on the panel talked about what's happening at local governments, but I couldn't even tell you how many bills we've had to vote in the House over the past year that basically just threw money at police in hopes that they'll address the public safety problems that we have, that we can't inherently solve by just calling the police. Meanwhile, we still don't have universal health care. You know this. Meanwhile, we still don't have school funding that is equitable. To put it in perspective, I just want folks to know in 2019 in our country, we spent approximately $255 billion on policing, prisons, and courts. If we counted as a military, America's police would be the third largest on earth, with a budget greater than the militaries of India, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and France combined, 3 of which have large nuclear weapons programs. So we have the largest military on the planet, bigger than all of the other top global militaries combined. Our police forces would count as the third largest on earth. And we have more people in prison than any other country in the world. Essentially, we have an addiction, y'all, to criminalization and policing. And we're feeding that addiction. When we're feeding that addiction, right? Not us in this room, but many of folks in power, they're depriving our communities of the resources that we need to truly be able to thrive. I know I could talk hours about the importance of this issue and talking about it in a way, again, as I'm a social worker at heart, I know that many folks that are afraid to talk about this because they're worried about criminal, terminology and so forth. But I want to give you all a lesson on something that I learned being here. Even when the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, was birthed, and this was some time ago, right? President Barack Obama was president at the time, and folks were starting to hold these signs, starting chanting that message of Black Lives Matter. Again, this is before the movement, again, turned into the marches and the rallies across the nation. And it was some of my colleagues that, again, they were my colleagues at the time, but there was a memo that leaked out that says, stay away from this movement. We don't like that terminology. We don't like Black Lives Matter. What do you mean? What does that mean? That's leaving people out. I mean, just so you know, many of those same people are now holding those signs. I don't know if they know what it means to really, what it means to say Black Lives Matter, but these are the same folks that ran across the street when we were marching and saying Black Lives Matter almost a decade ago now. And so it is important that, you know, as many folks want to focus on how we so-called message, these are lives. We're not in some sort of room looking at polling like many of my colleagues or trying to no, we really truly are trying to save lives. And the way we do it is investing in our communities and making sure we all have the ability to thrive. So I just thank you all so much for continuing to speak truth to power. Many of the panelists here, many of the folks that have been in the trenches talking about this before I even came along, but I want you all to know again, thank you for giving credibility to many of my families all across my district that say the same thing. What about my house that I'm literally getting ripped apart from me because I'm being overtaxed? What about, you know, my neighbor who's still looking for some sort of access to childcare so she can go to work? What about all of these things that I think, again, are connected to really making our community safer? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rashida. I know there are going to be a lot of questions about short-term, long-term strategies and what's viable now, what's viable within the context of working in the system as opposed to outside the system. We're now going to hear from Andrea Ritchie, who I expect will address some of those questions for us.
Thank you so much, Julie and Congresswoman Tlaib, and also Erin. It's really an honor and privilege to be here. I do want to honor the original stewards still present and resisting on this land of the Anishinaabe, Odawa, Wyandot, and Potawatomi people. I also want to thank you all for having me here in Detroit. I'm a recent relocator, a longtime fan. I've been coming to the Allied Media Conference here in this very auditorium sometimes since 2007, and have been shaped and learned so much from the communities here in Detroit. For folks who can't see me on the virtual screen, I am a very light-skinned Black woman with curly hair, and I'm wearing all black because I moved here from New York, so obviously. I also always want to introduce myself not only as a Black woman, but as a lesbian, an immigrant, and a survivor of state and interpersonal violence, both because some of those things are not so obvious by looking at me, but also because they deeply have shaped how I approach these issues in many ways. And I have spent the past more decades than I want to count documenting, organizing, advocating, litigating, agitating around the violence of policing, particularly as experienced by people in my community through the lens of the experiences of Black women, girls, queer, and trans people who experience the violence of policing in many of the same ways that we often talk about. Most folks don't know that Black women are the demographic most likely to be killed by police when unarmed of any demographic group. So many times we talk about how Black cisgender, assumed to be heterosexual men are perceived to be a threat by police, but clearly that statistic shows that Black women are equally, if not more, perceived to be a threat. And also experience very gender and sexuality specific forms of violent policing, including sexual violence, which is the second most reported form of police violence after use of force, policing of pregnancy and parenthood. Black women in some states are up to 10 times more likely to be drug tested during prenatal visits and when giving birth. So we talk about driving while Black, walking while Black. We don't talk about giving birth while Black, and we should. Or having an abortion while Black, or having an unplanned termination of a pregnancy while Black. And also very much experience policing in the context of calls for help. And so we've talked about mental health crisis response, we've talked about domestic violence response. Those responses are, particularly for Black women, girls, and trans people, very often the site of violence by police rather than protection or abandonment to violence. And so those are the realities that really shaped my coming to be an abolitionist, because when I often say that when you look at policing through the experiences of Black women, girls, and trans people, you get much more quickly to the reality that there is no protection in the system, that there is only more violence, policing, and punishment, and that policing also happens beyond the actual police, that they happen at the hands of the family police, they happen at the hands of the medical police, they happen at the hands of the welfare police, they happen at the hands of every institution is about policing, regulating, and punishing, surveilling, and excluding structurally Black women, girls, and trans folks from safety and the things that they need to access to achieve safety. And so some of the statistics that you heard, I wanted to throw in on because they really shape my co-authors approach the issue as well, which is that fewer than 4% of police calls, or between 4 and 10% of police calls, are for things that we think of police are needed for, like domestic violence, assault in progress, burglary in progress, et cetera. So 90% of what cops are doing is not what we think of them as doing, as like running to the scene of violence and valiantly interrupting it in their capes. And then the other piece that's really important is that the vast majority of survivors of violence never call police in the first place. 43% of domestic violence survivors and 75% of people who experience sexual assault aren't using the system that we're pouring $225 billion a year into to address the violence they're experiencing. People are experiencing violence of tremendous proportion and choosing nothing over police. That in and of itself is a crime. And I think that is where we need to be focusing on why we need to be looking for something more and better for ourselves as survivors and for the people in our communities who are experiencing violence. So I would say that, we called No More Police, which I co-authored with my Interrupting Criminalization co-founder, Mariam Kaba. I'm sure some of you have heard of her. Today, she was declared a Freedom Scholar, which I can't think of anything more appropriate to call her. We made 3 points in No More Police, a case for abolition. The first is that cops don't stop violence. And you heard many of the stats that we cite, many of the stats that Erin mentioned, as well as the ones about police not serving survivors and instead perpetrating violence against survivors, including sexual violence. One of the primary sites of sexual violence by police is when they're responding to calls for help. So literally cops will respond to a call for help around a sexual assault case and commit sexual assault in that context. So we're doubling up the violence. It's not just that we're not getting a response to the violence, we're actually adding into it often. So cops don't stop violence, they add their own violence into it. So one of the stats that we, when we're looking at kind of crime stats or violence stats, we're not thinking of how many of homicides or sexual assaults or physical assaults are being perpetrated by police. And the police themselves know that they don't stop violence. It was something that was very interesting to me when I taught a course on policing at UIC Chicago, is that their own textbooks say they don't stop violence. Their own textbooks say the number of cops, the response time, the manner of deployment, none of that stops violence. And it's a response after the fact. And then you saw the rates at which there's even any kind of progress as the system defines progress. We also argue, as Erin said, that cops can't be reformed. The system is doing exactly what it was set up to do. If it could be reformed, the things we've been doing over the last 100 years would have produced something. But instead, every single time there's a commission, there's an inquiry, there's a set of recommendations. They look the same, they're the same. Sometimes we throw in a little technology, but essentially we're producing the same recommendations and trying to repeat the same efforts to reform something that is doing exactly what it was set up to do. And so, and then the third thing that we argue is that we can and we are creating safety without policing and punishment and surveillance and exile. And we're doing that. There's data, again, that makes it really clear that if you invest in community safety organizations, homicides go down. But we're always given the choice of police or no police. And the key thing about abolition, it is about divesting from policing, not just financially, but ideologically and emotionally, breaking the addiction that the Congresswoman mentioned too. But it's about divesting police of funding, but also of power and legitimacy. But it's also divesting them from our imaginations. And really the fact that we can't imagine anything but cops or nothing. And in fact, the studies show that when we put something else or many other things in place that people have mentioned, that communities thrive and violence goes down. So that's the case that we make. And I think I will stop there and pass it to back to Madam Moderator and come back to you later.
Many important questions. And now, as our final presenter, I want to reintroduce Senator Stephanie Chang. Before I do, however, I was remiss in acknowledging and recognizing our wonderful poem reader, Jeffrey Edison, who has been in the trenches and is one of the founding members of the National Conference of Black Lawyers and has been fighting for racial and social justice for, I'll just say decades. I won't give a number to it, Jeff. Thank you so much for being here. And he's also one of the founders of the Coalition for Police Transparency and Accountability in Detroit. Now, Senator Chang.
Thank you so much. First, a shout out to my daughter, who's a trooper in here, eating and yeah. Anyway, so and thank you to the organizers of this event. It's really important conversation and one that I hope will continue. Not sure what's going on with the microphone, but I'll just keep going. Okay, so thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to the hosts. And quick shout out to Detroit Justice Center. You know, the divest invest work is so important, both at the local level, but we are also working. We've been having conversations actually for quite some time now about trying to pilot something at the state level. And so that's not going to be a big focus. I don't know, maybe I'll try standing up. I don't know. I'll just keep moving. What should I do? Okay. Oh, this works. This works. All right. I'll just stand right here and try not to move. But the divest invest work is so critical. And I love the fact that all of the things that you've put together in terms of recommendations have come really out of all of the conversations you've had in the community over a long period of time. And it just speaks volumes. And so I'm excited about working with my colleague, Senator Erica Geis, and we actually do have a Republican partner, which I'm hoping will stick with us in terms of trying to do some type of pilot at the state level. So that I wanted to just mention that real quick. Okay, so I've been in the legislature for 8 years and have served in the minority as a Democrat my entire time. I started in the legislature in 2015, pregnant with my first daughter, who's sitting right here. And one of the things that I worked on back in 2015, among lots of other things, was really the fact that I remember reading an op-ed by Mark Fancher of the ACLU of Michigan, pointing out the fact that in Michigan, we don't track use of force incidents. Like it's just not happening. Now we are to some degree, but back in 2015, I worked with some folks to introduce just really, honestly, such a basic legislation of like, let's track this data. And that I just wanted to mention that because 2015 seems like a long time ago because it was a long time ago, but also because I just think that we've come so far just in terms of being able to talk about issues related to police when 8 years ago, just the fact that like no one was introducing legislation about any of these things, except for me about just data. So just recognizing that we've come quite a long way, but obviously we have much more work to do. And a lot of the progress that I believe, just in being able to have these conversations is due to all of you and due to the groups that are here, really just continuing to work on this. So obviously in 2020, when George Floyd was murdered, I think that was like a huge wake-up call to much of the nation. However, many of us in this room and across the country already were very much passionate about making sure that we are changing the way that we do policing. And I remember, explaining to my daughter what happened to him, and it broke my heart because she was at the age where I felt like I could start to explain. I don't know if Sonia remembers, she's listening to me right now, I think. But I just remember having this conversation, and I also remembering that she just got it right away in the injustice that happened. And so I think that, that motivated me to really say, well, we've got to really try to do something. And, I knew at the time that, we've got this Republican legislature. What can we do meanwhile, like, here's my job at the state capitol and trying to do something meaningful that could save lives while also recognizing that folks on the ground are going to be pushing for and talking about bigger, bolder visions, and that's absolutely critical. So what can I do in my capacity now? So I actually did work with a number of colleagues on both sides of the aisle to put together a set of bipartisan legislation related to police accountability and transparency, worked with Julie and a number of other, the ACLU, just a whole lot of different groups across the state to really kind of figure out, okay, well, what are the things that we can do? What are the things that can actually get some bipartisan support? And, you know, people didn't believe that we would be able to put together a bipartisan package of bills, but we did. And so a year after the murder of George Floyd, we did introduce a set of bills around everything from independent investigations to having just consistent use of force policies across our whole state. Everything that actually we've done some polling and now know that the vast majority of Michiganders understand that, yes, you should have a verbal warning before using force. Yes, you should exhaust all other alternatives before using deadly force. Yes, there should be a use of force continuum. These are things that Michiganders understand. And regardless of what party you're from, people support. You know, right now we also have all of these issues related to officers moving from one department after they get fired, going to another department, and then that department not knowing why they got fired or what type of issues they might have had related to use of force. We've got a bill to address that. We also have this giant issue of, so there's this entity called MCOLS. Basically, without getting into all the details, they're the entity that issues licenses to police officers, and they don't have a very strong authority to revoke people's licenses, and even if they use excessive force. And so we've got to change that, and that bill actually is sponsored by a Republican. We have a bill related to banning the intentional disclosure of the identity of a person who makes a misconduct complaint against a law enforcement officer. We've got bills around banning the use of chokeholds, as well as banning the use of no-knock warrants. We've got a bill around establishing an affirmative duty to intervene to prevent the excessive use of force. We do have a bill around requiring training standards related to de-escalation, implicit bias, and behavioral health. And we also have a bill related to specifically prohibiting the tampering of body cams, because we know that that has been a huge issue. And then not as a part of this package, but I'm currently working on it. I'll just mention a bill related to foot pursuits, which we saw as a giant issue with what happened to Patrick Loyola in Grand Rapids, but we also know is a giant issue in Detroit and across the country. And here in Michigan, related to the fact that officers are pursuing people for things that they don't need to pursue them for. And by pursuing on foot, armed, it actually escalates the situation and makes it much more likely that someone's gonna get hurt or die. And so we, as Julie mentioned, all of these were done in the context of a Republican legislature where we were just trying to figure out, like, what could we possibly get done? And so we actually did have a number of hearings. Julie testified at one of the hearings, and she can tell you about what that experience was like and some of the questions that my Republican colleagues asked. It was, you know, it's what it is. It's what the current context is. However, in January, we are going to have Democratic majority in the state House and state Senate. And so that does provide an opportunity. And so, you know, I'm really committed to making sure that we continue to advocate and strengthen, as Julie mentioned, this set of legislation. And really, I think it's going to take a lot of people pushing from all ends of this spectrum of regardless of what words you're using, advocating and moving in the same direction. Because I will tell you that there are definitely folks that were elected that will be joining us in the Senate who are incredible people, but also serving in districts that don't look like Detroit and don't have the same types of views or may not feel as comfortable around some of these issues that we all in this room do. And so that's the context that I'm going to be working in. I'm going to work as hard as I can to make these changes because I know that they will save lives. They are policies that could really do a lot of good. Okay, one last thing that I forgot to mention earlier was that last year, I think it was last December, I did get a set of bills passed that I wanted to mention because it relates to things that everyone has mentioned related to mental health and related to, police responding to calls for help, and particularly calls for help for folks who are experiencing a mental health crisis or a behavioral health crisis. And so far too often people are calling 911 and they're, a cop shows up, most likely with zero training on behavioral health, and things can get bad really, really quick. There was a slide that mentioned Ann Arbor. Ann Arbor in Washington County is moving towards an unarmed response model. And there's a number of cities that are exploring this idea. And so I actually was able to pass a set of bills that is around creating some state infrastructure to support cities and counties that are moving in that direction of not responding to mental health crises with cops that aren't trained, but with folks who are actually trained mental health providers. And so providing grants, providing technical assistance, collecting all those best practices, and just really trying to amplify that work, which I know is happening at the local level, but we've got to do our part at the state level to support it as well. So eager to hear your questions and get into some dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we've now heard from a variety of views, although many of these views coincide with one another, yet they also seem to contradict one another. And I'd like to give our panelists an opportunity to discuss between yourselves and Congresswoman Tlaib behind us, me, the intersection and contradictions that exist between, on the one hand, using legislation to enact limited or moderate police reforms on the one hand, and the movement in the streets and policy centers for abolition and defunding, a revamping of the entire institution on the other hand. I guess I'd throw it out to Andrea to start with how you might view, and then you can talk to one another, which I would encourage you to do. How do you view the use of reforms, or do you see any value in the strategy of reforms to enact some modicum of, if not actual change, but some semblance of accountability?
There's so much to say about that. I'll start by saying
I'm going to give you like 3 minutes so
to
that
say all those things. Okay, so we named the chapter in our book Reform, spelled RE-FORM, to show that basically reform is about recreating the same thing in a different shape. And so we want to make sure that the changes that we're pursuing are not doing that. We're not creating something we need to tear down. We're going to come back and need to tear down, or that's going to produce more harm in a different form. So I guess I want to use my 3 minutes to sort of put at the center this question of an alternative to policing. And my co-author Mariam always really, at the beginning of the uprising, really when this conversation started becoming more widespread, saying we have to stop using the word alternative to police because it keeps policing at the center. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a replacement that looks like police or that feels like police. So maybe we don't want the cops to respond to a mental health crisis, but we want someone else to respond in a similar way, right? Show up, take someone away. Maybe not put them in a jail cell, put them in coerced treatment, incarcerate them in a psych ward. It's another form of incarceration. It's another form of surveillance, containment, and control. And the definition of abolition is no policing, surveillance, containment, control, or exile of any kind. So I think if we think about, or the same for homelessness, right? Maybe the cops shouldn't show up and sweep people, but we're going to get someone else to come and warehouse them somewhere else. Instead of thinking of an alternative to police, an exercise that organizers in Minneapolis and many other places have done is to think, let's look at where we see cops in our community now. And let's think, first of all, if anything needs to be there. And if instead, the problem they're addressing could be addressed by meeting someone's basic need. Instead of moving someone to a warehouse when they're unhoused, why don't we just have housing? Instead of waiting for someone to reach a crisis point because there is no universal national health care, What if we just made sure that everyone had access to everything they needed to address their mental health needs? What if we got 1,000 miles ahead of a crisis instead of organizing our lives around the crises that our current conditions are producing? So I think that's what stepping us out of this notion of alternatives to police enables us to do, is to really parse out what is just the fact material needs not being met that could be met with money that the cops are looting from our budgets and communities to the tune of 40 to 60%. And if someone needs to be there, what do they need to be doing? And how can we be training ourselves to be there for each other rather than delegating that to a state that's going to engage in policing in one form or another?
So I'm gonna present the same question to Senator Chang and Congresswoman Tlaib. I don't know who of you wants to speak first.
Well,
Rashida?
I don't know if folks have looked at Cori Bush's People's Response Act. I don't know if you would call it reform or not, but it's unarmed first responders to 911, you know, and having done 911 diversion programs. You know, doing housing security programs. So all of this would be housed under HHS. So it's a little bit, you know, moving us away from that addiction of even thinking about policing and moving towards direct human services. But it would basically establish what they would call a community safety division within the Department of Health and Human Services. I'm a co-sponsor of it, truly believe in this. When the pandemic happened, I introduced the ABC Act, where we not only did, you know, $2,000 per month while folks were struggling during that time, but we created kind of like an AmeriCorps type first responder corps that would basically go around the most vulnerable communities, and we defined it in a way that would include communities like ours, and helping them through the everyday challenges of living during the pandemic. And so these are things that I think myself and many of my colleagues are moving towards, is talking about health and human services, talking about funding those kinds of programs. You know, even when you look at the People's Response Act, which was really in co-authored with Movement for Black Lives. And in there, it really is around moving towards, you know, the youth and families, survivors of violence, exiting away from incarceration or criminal supervision, even in those kinds of spaces. But it is direct funding towards those kinds of programs. And again, moving away for that call not to be going towards police, but actually having someone that is in, I think, equipped or better equipped to deal with the trauma that's usually right behind those calls. So anyways, I think those are the kinds of approaches that myself and many of my colleagues are doing. At the same time, you know, I'm trying to ban facial recognition technology, got a full ban, and then banning it from public housing. Specifically, they're putting that racist technology on some of our, you know, on our public housing. But these are just some of the ideas that many of my colleagues are going. So of course, I know, Julie, you like us getting rid of the immunity, but I think some of us are of course supportive of getting rid of qualified immunity, but we're also moving away from even talking about policing, like one of our panelists discussed.
Erin, do you want to comment on this intersection?
Oh,
Stephanie?
okay. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is we've got to be talking about it in whatever, it's all important. So it's kind of what I think is that, you know, folks on the ground, okay, it's doing that thing again. Folks on the ground using, you know, words like defund and abolition, you know, obviously it fits with the work that you're doing. But in terms of the work that, you know, that we need to also do in the meantime of like, let's try to enact some policy change that will save some people's lives by, you know, we can save lives by banning no-knots and by banning chokeholds and by ensuring that we hold bad cops accountable when they use excessive force to make sure that they can no longer be police officers, right? So we know that we can save lives by doing those things. And so for me, that's why I don't think it should be one or the other in terms of, you know, you know, people's lives are worth saving. And so doing the work that, you know, I'm trying to focus on right now in the sort of immediate term, I think is really critical. And at the same time, having these larger conversations about, of course, you know, we need to fund housing. And that's a big focus of mine as well. And focusing on making sure that we're adequately funding our education system is, of course, a huge priority as well. And making sure that we're providing adequate and, you know, funding for all of the things that people mentioned before is huge and absolutely critical. And so, but of course, we've got to have folks who can shape a budget that reflects our values. And so I'm really hopeful that we can do that. And by having folks, you know, I'm a big believer in sort of like an inside outside strategy, right? And that's how I've been able to move other legislation in the past that's been meaningful. And so our message does not always have to be the same. And in fact, it's sometimes okay. I think sometimes it's better when we're using the words that resonate with the audiences that we're talking to. And so if I need to go convince, you know, more moderate colleagues of certain things that need to get done, I've got to use the words that appeal to them if we're going to try to achieve the results that we need. And at the same time, you know, we've got to push for bigger, bolder solutions as well. So I think that it's got to be all of the above in order to achieve both short-term wins, medium-term wins, and long-term wins.
Erin, I want to add something to this question. And that is within the context of this intersection and the inside-outside strategy that Stephanie just mentioned, I'd like to have you comment on why the words abolition and defunding. What are the strategic advantages or disadvantages to that terminology within the context of this movement? Is it a trigger? Does it not possibly provoke some of the moderate people that say Stephanie's trying to communicate with to just get stuck on the terminology? So could you comment on that?
So I'll answer both questions. I'll take your second one first.
Okay. In 3 minutes.
In 3 minutes, I'll do it. So first, I get this question a lot. Why use the term defund? It's so inflammatory. Why use the term abolition? It's so inflammatory. First of all, again, as I mentioned in my slide, we've been saying reallocate resources forever. We were saying that before George Floyd was murdered. We were saying that before the Black Lives Matter movement even started. We were using those words and people were saying, that's nice. It would be nice if we had money to do that. It would be nice if we had money to invest in our schools. It would be great. But where would that money come from? Oh, that's just so pie in the sky. It's so unrealistic. The moment advocates started using words like defund and abolish, people started listening. The reason we're in this room having a conversation about this years after this movement has started, years after the murder of George Floyd, is because we use words like defund and abolish. And I think what's needed more so than changing the terminology is educating people on what the terms mean and educating people about what they stand for and what really does it mean to abolish the police, or what would it even look like to reallocate resources through defunding? By show of hands, how many of you all ever heard the term reform the police or defund the police in high school? Raise your hand if you heard that term. Okay, so we have like 3 people. That's the problem. We're not learning, we're not educating ourselves on what our options even are. Our community members don't know what their options even are. They just want the violence to stop. They want the shooting to stop. They want the blight to stop. And that's reasonable. That's very reasonable for people who live in this community. I myself am a Detroiter. It's reasonable to want better for your community. But when we think that our only option is policing, we stop ourselves from having real conversations about real solutions. And so to end, you asked a specific question, which I wrote down. Is there value in reforms, right? There are 2 things that I wanted to highlight here briefly. First, we have to look at what we consider a reform. when we're pouring money into policing and enhancing their budget to do things like implicit bias training or to hire more officers who then can be trained in social work, but still have a policing background, when we're bloating their budgets even more and calling that reform, that is not actually helping to transform anything. It's just like Andrea said, reforming the same thing we had, right? So when we look at practices that center public safety, not policing, we have to ask ourselves, are those practices, are the things that we're advocating for inherently abolitionist? Do they help propel us towards abolitionist goals? Because the question is, there's going to be a value in a lot of things. There's a value in this phone, right? If you think that the only thing you can have is a cell phone, there's a value in this phone. This phone costs some money. But what if instead you could have this whole building? You could own this whole building. What would you choose? You would choose the building because you know there's more value in the building than there is in having this phone. And so the reality is there's more value in abolition as a whole for our society than there is in a minor reform. That's just a tweak. It's going to save some lives, but it's not going to save our society as a whole. So.
And Andrea, I'm going to turn to you to start this portion off. And I want to talk about not reforms so much, but civil rights laws themselves that are enacted to enforce the Constitution and to provide some modicum of accountability for the glaring abuses of rights that go on by police. And as a practicing civil rights lawyer myself, who specializes in police misconduct litigation, what are your views on how civil rights laws and private police misconduct litigation fit into this picture and this strategy? And you can.
Yeah, I guess I just want to say that quickly on the word, the demand around defund is that, you know, it says exactly what we want. We want to take money from here and put it over here. That's the power of it. And it's so powerful, the president keeps having to say it. And people keep having to declare the movement dead. If it's not powerful, you don't have to keep declaring it dead. So I just want to name that. And then I just do want to say that not all reforms are created equal. And that I have spent a lot of my time litigating, trying to do harm reduction. What can I do to reduce the harm of this system today while we build something else? That was my entire goal. I've been a member of the Lawyers Guild for 2 decades. I've been litigating that long. Turns out all the policy changes I won the most extensive policy changes, the NYPD patrol manual around interaction with trans people. I got 800 people off the sex offender registry in New Orleans and in Louisiana. I made precedent about, you know, treatment of discrimination by police against trans people. Lots of policy change. The same cops I sued, I never lost a case. The same cops I sued are still on the street doing the same thing. In fact, I came face to face with 4 of them when we were being tear gassed in 2020. I was like, oh, you, I see. Glad I sued you. So I think, and there are many times when those policy changes would happen and then clients would call me and say the same thing is still happening. You can get the most progressive policy change on paper. The thing is, cops aren't there to follow rules. They know the rules aren't for them. That's a quality of the system doing exactly what it was set up to do. So I don't think we can sue our way out of the problem. And I don't think that that changing policy, I tried, and many others along me have tried, changing policy through litigation is the way out of it. But it is a way of achieving reparations for people who have been harmed by police. And that is really important because we do want to achieve reparations now for people who have been harmed now by police. It's insufficient often, it's inadequate. And then sometimes we can advance the reforms that do bring us closer to abolition, the ones that take power, resources, legitimacy, and weapons away from cops. So if I can do litigation that takes a weapon away from a cop where he can't put someone on a sex offender registry for saying, I'll offer you oral sex for $50, that's a weapon I've taken away. And that is a reform in a litigation that is worth pursuing. And that has made a material change in the lives of the people who were subject to that requirement before. So I think we have to be very discerning about which reforms we're advancing that will actually produce material changes and save lives and bring us closer to the world we want, and which ones are rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. And I think that's true in the civil litigation that we're doing and in the policy advocacy that we're doing. And don't get me wrong, I have made mistakes on that path. And I have fallen prey to like oh, we should have a registry of cops who have been engaged in sexual violence, so they don't keep going from one department to the other. But in the end, that's not going to stop the sexual violence from happening. That's an after the fact thing. And you have to prove in a prosecution or get a substantiated complaint. Both of those things happen in 1% of cases. So now 90% of cases of cops engaged in sexual violence are still not being dealt with because 1% are on this registry, and then that's legitimating the whole thing. So I used to advocate for that. I stopped doing it because I saw it wasn't going to produce the material change that survivors of police sexual violence like myself need, which is the violence to stop before it happens. And certainly that there needs to, that we need to take away the tools and the power that cops have to engage in it in the first place. So reparations, absolutely. Take tools away, absolutely. But we're not going to sue our way out of the problem.
Do any of the three of you want to comment on that question? Okay. We have 30 minutes left of this program, and I thought if there are those of you out in the audience who may have a question, we have some people who have microphones who can bring the mic to you. It looks like Sarah at the back of the room, and well, we'll start with.
Hot mic. Thank you all for being here and everyone who's in attendance as well, virtually and in person. I guess if I formulated my question in my head in a good way is the similarities and differences with abolitionists, the OG abolitionists, slavery abolitionists, and police abolitionists. Because at one time, people were saying, oh, you can't get rid of slavery, and you abolitionists are crazy. And then, well, you can't get rid of police. What are we going to do about A, B, C, D? You abolitionists are crazy. So I was wondering thoughts on the similarities and differences in those things.
So who wants to comment on this historical analogy or overlap?
So I actually use this example a lot when I'm talking, when I do presentations. I fully agree with you. I think, again, there were probably people at one point who thought they could reform their way out of slavery. Like, let's just, pay them a little something. And we can all agree, hopefully, in this room that is preposterous. Similarly, I think when we look at policing and when we look at its origins, right? When we look at where did policing come from? Where did it originate? We have to really stop and engage with that reality and say, is this a system that we want to keep tinkering with? Or do we want to just create something that's evidence-based that might work better? And I don't think that is inherently radical or crazy. It just requires being willing and open-minded enough to do some analysis. It also doesn't mean necessarily that if you hold a view like you want more for your community, that you hate all police officers, or that you don't care about violence, or that you haven't experienced violence, or that you haven't been the victim of a crime, right? All of those things can be true, and you can still want to interrogate this question of why we think police is synonymous with public safety. So I think that your analysis and your question was spot on. And I think that we really have to be open and willing to consider the origins of these systems that perpetuate the violence we currently grapple with.
Thank you for that. Anybody else want to speak to that question?
I just want to jump in quickly to say, invite people to read an amazing book called Abolition, Feminism Now by Dr. Angela Davis, Beth Ritchie, Erica Miners, and Gina Dent, which talks about this idea that Angela Davis has been talking about for a while around, can we create an abolition democracy? And I think for me, the abolition of police, prison, continuing the unfinished business of the abolitionist movement that was about abolishing slavery, because those are vestiges of slavery, as we would say in 13th Amendment jurisprudence, or they are the afterlives of slavery, and that policing and containment and control are happening in new forms, targeting Black lives And that's why we say Black Lives Matter in similar ways and through many institutions that operated during slavery and are operating in similar ways now, from the medical industrial complex to others, the way social services and other things operate. So I think it really is about the unfinished business of ending the vestiges and remnants and the afterlives of slavery in the United States. And there's some really great thinking about what it would mean to build an abolition democracy from W.B. Du Bois and others thinking about that in projecting to the future.
I believe.
I feel like you guys keep looking back at me. I mean, what an incredible idea of getting rid of criminalization of folks. I mean, think about the times that many of our families had to call. I mean, it's unbelievable to me that someone like the person in the audience would be thought of as radical. I don't think it's radical to say maybe one day we don't need a police structure in our country. And so I think, folks do get hung up on the terminology, especially here in Congress. I'll tell you, they don't like certain words. They police my words. They don't like certain things. But I'll tell you this, what I found profound, and my team and I did this intentionally, you put a kind of a survey out. I talked about defund police. Of course, the response was very different and skewed. But then I talked about what it meant separately. And overwhelmingly, over close to like 70%, something crazy, like it jumped at people saying, yeah, I want that. So sometimes I'm like, everyone needs to just stop getting hung up on the terminologies and the whatever. And I'll say defund police, everyone knows. And I know what it means, abolish ICE. I say, oh, stop saying those words. It makes folks uncomfortable, whatever. Honestly, our mere existence, y'all, make people uncomfortable. And so just know that sometimes I can start off by explaining what it is before I use term, because I don't want people, they literally shut down because society has taught them to just shut it down. No. Oh my God, how can we live like, it's like, but do you know what we're trying to say here? In regards to a child being met with someone that can help them instead of jail them. So anyways, I really love that question. And I also, as according to, from Detroit Justice Center, I've also talked about that as well, in a way, just, privately to colleagues, just to shock them. It's fun sometimes.
If I could just pick up on what Congresswoman Tlaib mentioned, just around the idea of like talking to people and getting beyond like a few words. I think it really is important, right? Like no matter what setting you're in. And so, I mean, how did we get a Republican on board with the idea of doing a divest, invest, state pilot project? It was because we like talked about like this model in Colorado and how we could do something similar in Michigan, and here's how it would like support communities around these different programs. And so it was like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. So I totally agree. And like having the conversations, especially with people that you might assume are going to disagree, because there's so much room in between where you can actually get folks to really come on board if you drill down into like, this is what we're talking about here. So just wanted to agree on that point for sure.
Good evening to the esteemed panel, members of the audience. My real name is Rick Brown, but I feel like I should be called Daniel in the Lion's Den because I'm vice president of the Metro Detroit chapter of NOBLE, which stands for National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. I'm also chief of police in Detroit Transit Police. I'm also retired commander from Detroit Police Department when I joined at 18 years old back in 1977. So I've seen a lot. And the reason I had to be here was to hear what you all had to say. The only way we can solve any of these problems is to do what we're doing now. And that is to have an honest, open dialogue and understand the other party's interests, what they're saying. Okay, so I wanted to make sure that we offered to the panel the local chapter of Noble's involvement so that we can make some things happen from our perspective. I was sitting on the sofa when all the police reform came up, and I said, okay, I got to get off the sideline and get in the game, okay? Because I was also part of the Southeast Michigan Chiefs of Police, and they were reporting out at our monthly meeting of how they were going to the legislation and talking about police reform. And the first question I had was, where's the person of color who actually works in the community, the Black community especially? And there was no one. So that's when I said, okay, it's time for us to get off the sofa, get in the game and make some things happen. We've met with the governor's office, the attorney general's office. The first thing we say is, yes, we're here to give a perspective of reforming police from our perspective, because we know what we're talking about, one. Second, we need to look at what's going on in the community. We have to fix the problem from both sides, not just one, but from both sides. And I haven't heard anything. I'm cutting it off in a second.
Do you have a question?
Yes. Has anyone thought of the actual deep down root problem of violence also? And that's something that, you know, the deep root of violence.
Yeah, and Julie, just so you know, I talk to a lot of officers, you'd be surprised. You know, growing up in Southwest Detroit, a lot of, you know, high school friends, others, young man that I mentored became a police officer. And sometimes just sitting down, many have expressed, it's just unbelievable that they go to the same house over and over again for domestic violence, and they have no place to take the mom and the kids anywhere. They get the same call over and over again to move homeless neighbors from one spot to the next. They get the call, the same house for mental health struggle in crisis and something happening. Same families that need help. They're going to call. I mean, it's like they know they're going to go to that house. They know exactly what's going to happen. It's all there. And I think one of them told me, because domestic violence has increased dramatically during the pandemic, that they were also helping. They call de-escalation. They called it something, I don't, well, he called it, now I got to do marriage counseling, Rashida, come on. And I said, you know, the point is that, you know, I just want you to know, when you talk about both sides, I don't know what that means, but I want you to know, like, you know, many of my officers have been fed also this issue around, and I'm not saying it's different when you grow up with a person and so forth. I've met some that, you know, are proud affiliation with an organization that don't want to see someone like me in Congress, right? But just even talking about this cycle and the struggle even within the fact that majority of the calls are mental health calls all across the country, not just here at home in Detroit. And it's overwhelming. And now though, you guys, this is what's crazy. Now though, you know, there's this talk about let's have grants on mental health, but they want to house it at the police with the police. What? I'm like, wait, no, I'm for those kinds of grants, but I'm like, why, wait, they can't do it. That's not, and you can't train. That is something that you can't with a gun, you cannot be showing up to talk to an 11-year-old girl that's just been, you know, beaten by her father. And what Detroit Justice Center says over and over again about that is true. I've seen it in my own family, where my niece was made to be the problem when it wasn't her, it was the adult. But at the same time, that officer could not fix what was going on. They're going to continue showing up at that same house over and over again. But anyways, I just want you to know, you know, to the gentleman, I know your name's not Dan. You said I think your real name first, and for some reason Dan stuck in my head. But I just want you to know, when a mother does come up to me and say, you know, Rashida, my son is a police officer, you know, I can hear her. She's worried that somehow I said, I want your son to be safe. The way I'm going to help your son be safe is I'm going to fight so hard to make sure my schools are funded properly, that my neighborhoods have parks for kids to go, that we have programs in the community, that we have domestic violence shelters, that we are literally having programs that are combating poverty in the same urgency that we show. You know, they want to do $845 billion for war, for military complex, shifting even a chunk of that towards this and keep her son safe. So I just, you know, again, when we talk about the what, sometimes we can get folks to listen, but yeah, I'm sorry, Julia, I know he didn't have a question, but I just want him to know I'm not shutting down, I'm listening, but not because whatever, but because many of these folks I grew up with in Southwest and they know what it is, but they're still struggling with the system because unfortunately they are now working in a system that's history and whatever is built on, honestly, a lot of violence and targeting and racism.
I know, Erin, you had indicated you want to comment.
And I'll be succinct. The question you asked was, have you thought about violence and addressing violence? You can't be from Detroit and you haven't thought about violence. You grew up here. That's the running narrative, despite all the positive things that happen in our community, despite the way our neighborhoods are rebuilding themselves, despite all of the positive things that go on here. The recurring rhetoric is violence. The violence is so bad. The violence is so terrible. You can't live here and haven't thought about that. The reality is that police don't make us safer. Police don't stop the violence. And you want to know why? It's because primarily, not in every case, but primarily, police are arriving at the scene after the violence has already occurred. They're showing up to try to maybe investigate the violence, but they're not preventing inherently the violence. If we could police our way out of violence, we would have the safest community in all of this area, all of Michigan. We would have the safest community. We wouldn't have this running rhetoric about Detroit being violent. We spend $1 in every $3 on this. We're constantly investing in surveillance technology, millions and millions of dollars. Every day there's a new thing. Oh, we need to fund this. We need to fund this, and this will make us safer. Instead of just stopping and saying, wait a second, what if we turn these dollars internally? What if we ensured all our students could read? What if we ensured that people had a home and that their houses weren't illegally foreclosed on? What if we ensured that people, when they experience a violent incident, their first response is not retribution, but it's going to get trauma intervention services? What if we made that free? So if you care about violence, then you can't just stop at, oh, what if we give our police more money? It's because we care about the violence that we're in this room. So I just wanted to directly answer your question because we do care about the violence.
I just want to quote one of my dear comrades, Erin Miles Cloud, who made it really succinct. You know, everyone cares about someone's safety somewhere, some of the time. Abolitionists care about everybody's safety everywhere, all of the time. We don't stop thinking about violence. Many of us are survivors of violence. This movement to defund and abolish police is led by survivors who know what the root causes of violence are and know what needs to prevent and heal from violence, and know police budgets are looting the resources that we need in order to achieve those things. So we think about nothing but the root causes of violence and how to address them.
I have a question, but I think my law partner, Bill Goodman, is first, so.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to note, and everyone else should, and not forget that 2 days ago, December the 4th, was the 53rd anniversary of the murder of Fred Hampton, which was accomplished and engineered by a group of police officers working together, and engineered by J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the FBI at the time. And since then, that's 1969, it seems to me that things have gotten worse in terms of police misconduct and brutality, even though that was an incredible sample of the police out of control. And not only that, but the law's gotten worse since then. We have to deal with something called qualified immunity. Those of us who are victims of police misconduct and those of us who are lawyers and work in that area which makes it virtually not impossible, but damn difficult to get people justice or reparations, as it was referred to. So my question to the panel is this. How do you view the history over the past 50 years in terms of how it affects your ability to achieve either reform or abolition? And have things gotten better, worse, or just as bad as ever? That's it.
Who would like to start out to try to answer that question?
The person who's old enough to answer it, I don't know. Born the year
I
Fred
would like
Hampton was
to
killed.
inject another component to that question, if I may. We've been hearing a lot tonight about the laws, about funding, about the need to reallocate or defund or divest and reinvest, I think is a more appropriate way of describing it. One thing that just has been lurking in my mind throughout this whole evening is the culture of policing is so entrenched that I don't think it's possible to have this conversation without addressing the impossibility of changing or redefining the culture of policing. You can pass all the laws you want, you can file all the lawsuits you want, you can enact all the policies and procedures, but what do we do about the mindset that goes into the head of somebody who may start out like Rashida's mentee as this really nice, well-meaning person who decides to become a police officer, and then within how many period, a year, 2 years, 5 years, they have internalized the culture so intensely that every time they go out in the street, it doesn't matter what's happening, everybody out there is a criminal. Everybody out there is the enemy. It's a war zone. And I'd like to know how that fits into the history of how things have evolved or devolved over the last 50 some years, and how the culture of policing ties into how you view these issues.
I mean, I think that the culture of policing is not just about what the culture department is, but the culture that all of us have internalized. So I think what's happened in my lifetime, at least, which is that period of time that you were mentioning, is that criminalization has become the default response to everything. Every hurt, every harm, every conflict, every need, and it has permeated and pervaded every single institution, such that often the first government representative that many people, particularly in communities that have experienced over that same period of time, what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls organized abandonment, which is systemic divestment and retrenchment of presence of state and common public goods, and the only presence is police, is that the first person they run into that they represent the state is a police officer, right? And that's the most common person they run into. And that's often the only number to call for anything, because everything else has been divested from, everything else has been defunded during that time, or enmeshed with police in the way that we were talking about earlier. Like if you get a service, it's an arrest referral system. And then your service is coerced. That's not a service, and that's not meeting needs. And then the number of police officers has obviously increased exponentially, their power, their resources, their tools. But I think also just their entrenchment in our imagination as like the only authorities on public safety. So that's what I've seen over that time. I did want to say something about qualified immunity. Obviously it gets in our way. I've probably called you, Bill, several times to help me understand and fight around qualified immunity. I just want to name that it's something that, again, like everything else, comes into play after the fact, right? So yes, it gets away in the reparations, but I don't want the person to need reparations at all in the first place. So I'm not against abolishing qualified immunity, but I'd much rather focus on the front end of this spread of policing, criminalization, violence, and control that I was just referring to.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on this?
So, I mean, one of the things that, okay, I don't know, this is not a fully formed response, so I'm just going to say whatever comes to my brain. But one of the things that I was thinking about was the legislature is just like a really a weird place. So, So I've been on the committees related to judiciary and criminal justice like my entire time in the legislature. And like we'll like start moving in this direction and then we'll like do something that seems completely in the other direction. And so then thinking about decriminalizing things, we've done like a whole bunch of bills that we've passed related to criminal justice reform in relation to, you know, getting folks out of prison earlier, getting like decriminalizing things, shortening sentences. And then we'll go and there'll be people who introduce bills to like create new crimes for this or create new crimes for this. So it's just like I said, it's a weird place. And so I don't know, I would say the same thing to any of my colleagues. So I feel fine if like, I'm sure people are recording this. We respond to crises. We respond to what people are saying when they contact our office. And we do respond to obviously proposals for change, but then we also, we move in this direction and then we move back in this other direction. And so I think what we're desperately in need of, and that I'm hoping we can shift towards, is just being able to step back and actually say, well, what are we doing here? And what are our overarching goals? And just move in one direction. So the reason I'm saying all this is in terms of your question of where are things getting better? Are things getting worse? In terms of the Michigan legislature, I honestly have no idea, because I feel like sometimes things are getting better. And obviously I'm very optimistic about, finally serving in a majority and hopefully chairing a committee where I can work on this issue even more. However, I also think that it's going to be really, it's going to be challenging in a different way. And so, but I do think that where we are now compared to 8 years ago when I started in the legislature, we're just so much further along in terms of being able to at least talk about these things, where I think like when I first started, I don't know if any of my, I probably could count on like one hand how many colleagues would actually want to talk about this issue with me. So we're moving somewhere.
There's a question that came in from one of our virtual attendees that's sort of, I think it's a segue here. And here's the question. And it really goes mostly to the two of you here. How can we trust politicians to divest from something they profit from as they represent? I don't know if there's they represent the state.
I don't profit from that. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I don't know about profit. Maybe they're saying benefit. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what that question.
I think they're talking. I think this question is not directed to you individually, but to politicians as a class. This question.
Look, we have these institutions. I can't. I was in the legislature for 6 years, and here I can tell you, it's probably more like because not to call out certain delegations from New York and other places who have strong financial connections with the police unions. So I know Senator Chang, I can't speak for her, but I know I haven't, there's not like that. There's not that same large scale kind of union donations, contributions to candidates, or this relationship that I feel like becomes, a conflict of interest in many ways. But, look, it's very ironic. You guys might be surprised. So I don't know if you all know, they used to call me the scrap metal girl, because I took on the scrap metal industry when I was in the legislature. It was such a huge issue for the police department, the fire department, the Michigan Association of Police Chiefs, Judy, truly gave me Legislator of the Year award for taking on the scrap metal yard, whatever. I don't know if I benefited from it, but when they came in, I was like, oh, I got, and I know they probably are like, I don't know, but I took on this for-profit, it was awful, for-profit schemes that were going on in the city with a lot of really folks that, allowed our schools, our abandoned buildings, our schools, everything just getting torn up. And they were, it was awful just to see even my fire departments working for the scrap metal industry. But the point is, I think for whoever is asking this question, I am not going to be up here defending my colleagues. You're absolutely right. I can tell you, candidates, us members are not your destination, folks. That's not. When you go to the ballot, we're not your destination. We're the door to the possibility of where we want to get to. Okay. And so if you can find a door, and I would consider myself a door that's open, and working with myself and others. And again, you all doing what you're doing already. I don't need to, I love it. It's organic, it's beautiful, it's real. That gives credibility of what I'm trying to do. And when I tell my colleagues, when I had the Movement for Black Lives speak to the Congressional Progressive Caucus, I saw the transformation. All of a sudden, it was because I said, come here, can you all do it? Because if I do it, it's like, oh, well, and again, just like the person asking the question, some of us see our colleagues that way. We're not sure where they're coming from. Is it for financial gain or some sort of other gain that has nothing to do with really uplifting or helping their residents and so forth? So that's why I bring movement folks with me. If it's doing a briefing, if it's helping establish Justice for All Civil Rights Act to address some of the things Bill Goodman was talking about of our, conservative courts making decisions that don't allow us access to reparations. All of that to say, but it is, again, I'm sorry I'm not answering it in a succinct way, but just know this, I can speak only for myself, but you're absolutely right. There are colleagues of mine that will not see this issue with the same lens, and it may be conflicted because of donations and relationships and unhealthy and probably a very unhealthy relationships with their police unions.
Okay, thank you. That's a great answer. It is 8:29, and I would like to just, and I know that everybody has so much more to say, but I would like to just propose the question to all four of you to help wrap things up. Where do we go from here? How do we move forward from here? And Erin, you've been wanting to speak, so I'm gonna let you
That's a loaded
answer this
question.
first.
I will kind of give my answer without having a lot of time to formulate it. Kind of as a response to Bill's question. He said, do we feel like things are getting better? And I may not have been alive long enough to know if they're in fact better, but I'm still young enough to be hopeful, right? I'm still young enough not to be jaded and to be optimistic about where we can go from here. The fact that we're having this conversation in a law school gives me hope. The fact that there's so many people on this call, there's still 109 participants. I think at one time I saw 150. The fact that this many people are here caring to learn about these concepts gives me so much hope. And I think where we go from here is to not fall for the okie doke. When it comes to electing politicians that we can trust, we should do that. When it comes to being engaged in our local level, we should do that. That's where a lot of these decisions are made. That's where a lot of these conversations happen. When it comes to looking at our judicial officers, we should be invested in who is making these decisions, right? But ultimately, we do have the power to transform our policing. We have the power to decide we don't want this system as it currently exists anymore. And we can educate ourselves and educate our communities and bring people with us to the polls and bring them with us to events like this. And we can truly transform what this looks like. So I'll turn it over.
I am also still young, I think, and also still feeling optimistic. And, I feel like we've got to keep having these conversations and bring them out into every single neighborhood possible and into uncomfortable territory in terms of folks that we might think are on the opposite end of this conversation. And I just think that we've got to keep talking. As far as like mine, I am obviously I'm going to have a lot of work to do, and look forward to just continuing to work with many of the folks in this room to really, figure out a strategy and a plan going into January, alongside many of my amazing colleagues, because I think we've got to be thoughtful, we've got to be strategic, and we've got to be able to figure out what we can get done in a short amount of time, while also being mindful of obviously the bigger, bolder vision and goals that are there, that we need to keep moving. We need to keep moving.
Rashida.
So something I say to so many folks, I, as a young organizer, heard Grace Lee Boggs say this all the time. She said it way more eloquently than I will, but she says transformative change doesn't happen with who's in the White House or who's in Congress. It happens with what we do in the streets with movement. And we didn't get the Civil Rights Act because of somebody in Congress saying, ooh, this is a really great idea. Or the president saying no, it was because people boycotted, they protested, they demanded it. Same thing with the right to organize unions in the workplace. Didn't happen because the president at the time or the Congress and the leadership said this is a great thing. I'm sure there was a number of folks that supported, but again, it was the movement work in the community and the streets that made it even remotely possible. So that's where we go from here, supporting movement work, extending that. And that means knocking on our doors, making sure that you're holding us accountable, but also building this amazing, I think, I call it the chosen family movement. It is what's going to result in some of this meaningful change. Again, I could have never imagined ever that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, again, agree with it or not, I was sitting there, I was in disbelief. I was like, there's no way. Passed with like Republicans supporting it. But it was because at the moment, because they won't pass it now, but at the moment, watching George Floyd be murdered, in video, at that time moved it. But then what happened afterwards, y'all? We started marching, we didn't stop. And it made it, and I just felt like, oh my God, this could be possible. But again, it would have not happened because of who's in, because you all demanded it out in the streets. Just like the right to be able to control our bodies. When the legislature in Michigan didn't act, we said, we're gonna go collect some we're gonna do it ourselves. So just remember the power that you all have. Because again, Grace Lee Boggs taught us that early on in Detroit as a younger, I just remember her saying that, and that calmed me down in thinking and blaming, oh, this person, they're not our destination. President Biden is the door, not the destination.
And I'm giving Andrea the last word here.
Oh, boy. Well, definitely.
Where do we go from?
Grace would have us asking ourselves what time it is on the clock of the world. And despite the dire things I said earlier, I'm still hopeful because never in my lifetime did I think we'd be having this conversation at the scale that we're having, that we would be questioning the premise of criminalization as a response to everything. And just before I came here today, I was working all day on a report kind of reflecting where we are, called Still Fighting, Still Building. And more organizers around the country are engaging more and more people in conversations about what safety is and requires than ever before. More and more people are experimenting with new ways of meeting our individual and collective needs and building skills and strategies and ideas of how to build safety in community. And you can find some of those at millionexperiments.com. And more people are still fighting budget fights and winning budget fights across the country to get the resources to build the things that communities need to be safe. So where we go from here is we continue to build the relationships in our communities with each other that will enable us to survive the cataclysms we're living through now and those to come, and to demand the resources that we need to build the communities we want. So onward with that.
And on that note, we're a little bit over time. I want to thank all of you for coming and sharing this with us this evening, and all of those of you who are still with us online. all 103 of you, and I do believe it was up to about 150 at some point during the program. Thank you. Thank you for your patience at the beginning with the technical problems. And let's all keep talking. Let's all keep fighting. Let's all keep struggling in all of the arenas that we're in to overcome someday. And let's hope we survive the next. Yeah, I was gonna say 4 years, but okay, 48 hours is good. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye.